From the UN Climate Summit in Katowice, Poland, this is Democracy Now!
When school started in August this year, I sat myself down on the ground outside the Swedish Parliament. I school striked for the climate. Some people say that I should be in school instead. Some people say that I should study to become a climate scientist so that I can solve the climate crisis. But the climate crisis has already been solved. We already have all the facts and solutions. And why should I be studying for a future that soon may be no more, when no one is doing anything to save that future?
A school strike for climate activists, a school strike for climate. 15-year-old Swedish climate activist Greta Thunberg has made international headlines for her months-long strike against climate change. She's come to Poland with a message for world leaders.
And since our leaders are behaving like children, we will have to take the responsibility they should have taken long ago. Thank you.
We'll speak to Greta Thunberg, who has just been named one of the world's most influential teenagers by Time magazine. Plus, we speak to climate scientist Kevin Anderson, who's calling for a Marshall Plan to shift the world away from fossil fuel-based energy to avoid catastrophic climate change. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from the UN Climate Summit in Katowice. British Prime Minister Theresa May is holding emergency talks with European leaders today, one day after calling off a key parliamentary vote on Brexit. The United Kingdom is due to leave the European Union on March 29th, but many key issues remain unresolved. This comes as the European Union is rejecting calls by May to reopen negotiations on Brexit. In France, President Emmanuel Macron delivered a national address last night after 4 weeks of unrest and mass protests throughout France, organized by the movement known as the Yellow Vests. He proposed changes to taxation and minimum wage increases for low-wage earners.
I ask the government and parliament to do what is necessary so one can live better on his work salary from the beginning of next year. The salary of a minimum wage earner will increase by €100 a month starting in 2019, with no extra cost to employers. For those who get less than €2,000 each month, starting 2019, we will cancel the Social Security tax hike passed this year.
President Macron did not reimpose a tax on the wealthy, which many have called for. The Trump administration scheduled to announce today a major rollback of the nation's clean water regulations. The rule change decreases the number of waterways protected by the U.S. Clean Water Act. Critics warn this could result in expanded oil drilling and mining in once protected areas and lead to an increase in chemical pollutants, including pesticide runoff. The proposal is the latest in the Trump administration's efforts to weaken environmental laws after loosening regulations for car emissions, mercury and coal, and opening up previously protected areas for gas and oil drilling. Over 1,000 climate activists flooded Capitol Hill Monday, demanding Congress members and likely incoming House Speaker Nancy Pelosi back a Green New Deal committee proposed by Congressmember-elect Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez of New York. Over 140 people were reportedly arrested as members of the youth climate group Sunrise Movement occupied and lobbied at congressional offices. 26 Congress members have backed the formation of the Green New Deal Select Committee thus far, including Jim McGovern, the incoming chair of the House Rules Committee, who voiced his support after an exchange with activists yesterday. Pelosi's office has said it will meet with representatives from Sunrise Movement. Here at the COP24 in Katowice, Poland, indigenous and youth leaders disrupted an event Monday hosted by Trump administration officials promoting fossil fuels and nuclear interests.
My name is Vic Barrett. I'm here with the Sustain Us delegation, but also a plaintiff on the Our Children's Trust lawsuit. And what just happened was the Trump administration and the fossil fuel industry tried to co-opt the space that exists here at COP in order to push their own agenda forward. And so young people and people that have been in the community here have decided that we needed to interrupt it and call attention to real solutions.
Shame on you! Shame on you!
This comes as The Intercept is reporting that an executive from Shell Oil told participants at a COP side event that Shell helped draft a portion of the 2015 Paris Climate Agreement dealing with emissions mitigation. He made the remarks at an event for corporate actors, including the fossil fuel industry, saying, quote, "The European Union's position is not that different from how Shell sees this," unquote. This morning, activists protested outside an event hosted by Shell. Among those demonstrating was Rita Waka and Nemo Bassi of Nigeria.
It's like hell on earth. I represent communities in the Niger Delta who are impacted by this big polluter. Having these big polluter coming here as a saint is not only a slap on us as delegates of COP, is also a slap on Mother Earth.
I have many things to tell Shell. I don't think I can tell them all in one day. Number one is they have to stop polluting the Niger Delta. Number two, they have to clean up their mess. Number three, they have to get out of the COP.
Activists here at the Climate Summit are not allowed to specifically name oil and gas companies in their protests under threat of having their accreditation taken away by the United Nations. In Morocco, 164 countries have agreed to a non-binding UN-sponsored deal that seeks to better respond to migration at the global level, particularly for refugees and other vulnerable populations. The United States, along with a handful of other countries, rejected the deal. According to UN numbers, there have been over 3,300 deaths or disappearances during international migration so far this year. In Britain, 15 activists who blocked a charter plane from deporting nationals of Nigeria, Ghana, and Sierra Leone in March 2017 have been convicted of terrorism and could face life sentences. Members of the group End Deportations chained themselves to an aircraft, preventing it from taking off from Stansted Air Base near London. The activists became known as the Stansted 15 in an anonymous op-ed published in The Guardian. One of the people who was nearly deported by the charter flight at the airport wrote of the news, quote, "There is no doubt in my mind that these 15 brave people are heroes, not criminals. Without their actions, I would have missed my daughter's birth and faced the utter injustice of being deported from this country without having my now successful appeal heard." In San Diego, California, over 30 faith leaders were arrested at the U.S.-Mexico border Monday as they held a gathering in support of Central American migrants, calling for an end to their detention and deportation. The group is also calling on Congress to defund Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and Customs and Border Protection, CBP. Some 400 people came out to the demonstration organized by the American Friends Service Committee. The group had planned to hold a prayer circle at the border wall before they were stopped by police and Border Patrol. Nearly 3,000 people died in Yemen in November, making it the deadliest month in the past 2 years in Yemen, which has been devastated by the U.S.-backed Saudi war. The Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project said the Saudi coalition intensified attacks ahead of the peace talks that recently began in Sweden. The talks mark the first time the Saudi-backed government and the rebel Houthis are holding direct negotiations. During the talks, the UN proposed joint control of the port of Hodeidah, a central issue in the ongoing conflict. The meeting came as the UN and aid groups offered another stark warning of the unfolding humanitarian crisis in Yemen in a new report that says more than half the population is now food insecure, with 5 million people in an emergency hunger situation and 65,000 in a catastrophe hunger situation. The most severe phrase. Meanwhile, in Yemen, protesters gathered in front of UN headquarters to protest the closure of the Sana'a airport and the blockade at the port of Hodeidah.
We came out today to speak and make the whole world hear the voice of those Yemenis who are suffering from this blockade. The blockade by enemy forces headed by the U.S., Israel, and Saudi Arabia. A blockade that they should end unconditionally.
The Supreme Court delivered a victory to Planned Parenthood on Monday after it rejected appeals by Louisiana and Kansas, who sought to block Medicare funding for the women's health care provider. The decision left in place a ruling by lower courts against the state's rights to withhold government funding for public health programs. In his first known vote on the Supreme Court, Justice Brett Kavanaugh sided with Planned Parenthood. Russian gun rights activist Maria Butina has pleaded guilty to one charge of conspiring to act as a foreign agent without registering with the Justice Department. Butina has been jailed since July after being accused of trying to infiltrate the NRA and other right-wing groups. According to the plea deal, Butina, quote, sought to establish unofficial lines of communication with Americans having power and influence over U.S. politics. She sought to use those unofficial lines of communication for the benefit of the Russia Federation, unquote. Maria Butina is now cooperating with prosecutors. In September, prosecutors admitted they wrongfully accused her of trading sex for influence with high-level Republicans by misinterpreting joking text messages. Russian human rights activist and Soviet dissident Lyudmila Alexeyeva has died at the age of 91. Alexeyeva co-founded the human rights group Moscow Helsinki Group and was a typist for an underground publication chronicling human rights abuses by the Soviet regime. She was exiled for her work and lived in the U.S. before returning to Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. More recently, she spoke out against Russian President Vladimir Putin, condemning the 2014 annexation of Crimea and Putin's crackdown on human rights and political opponents. She continued to participate in street protests into her 80s and was arrested in 2010. And independent journalist and author William Bloom died Sunday at the age of 85 at a hospice in Virginia. Early in his career, Bloom worked with computers at the U.S. State Department, but left after becoming disillusioned with the American war in Vietnam. He co-founded the underground paper, The Washington Free Press. Bloom's books, Killing Hope and Rogue State, were widely praised for their detailed history of recent U.S. foreign policy. Bloom said of his work, quote, "The thesis in my books and my writing is that anti-American terrorism arises from the behavior of U.S. foreign policy. It's what the U.S. government does, which angers people all over the world," William Bloom wrote. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. We're broadcasting from the UN Climate Summit in Katowice, Poland, where world leaders are gathered to negotiate climate solutions that could dictate policy for years to come. But we begin today's program with a climate activist who says politicians here are not doing enough to turn back the clock and prevent catastrophic climate change. 15-year-old Greta Thunberg. She's made international headlines since launching a school strike against climate change in her home country of Sweden earlier this year. She sat on the steps of the parliament in Stockholm every school day for 3 weeks leading up to the Swedish election in September to demand that politicians take more radical action to stop global warming. After the election, she went back to school, but only for 4 days a week, because every Friday, Greta continues to sit outside the Parliament building. Her actions have inspired thousands of students across the globe to do the same. Greta has Asperger's syndrome. She's focused with laser intensity on climate change since she was 9 years old. She brought her message directly to world leaders here in Katowice at the UN Climate Summit. Here she is addressing UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres last week.
For 25 years, countless of people have stood in front of the United Nations climate conferences, asking our nation's leaders to stop the emissions. But clearly, this has not worked, since the emissions just continue to rise. So I will not ask them anything. Instead, I will ask the people around the world to realize that our political leaders have failed us. Because we are facing an existential threat, and there is no time to continue down this road of madness. Rich countries like Sweden need to start reducing emissions by at least 15% every year to stay below a 2-degree warming target. You would think the media and every one of our leaders would be talking about nothing else, but they never even mention it. Nor does hardly anyone ever mention that we are in the midst of the 6th mass extinction, with up to 200 species going extinct every single day. Furthermore, does no one ever speak about the aspect of equity, clearly stated in the Paris Agreement, which is absolutely necessary to make it work on a global scale. That means that rich countries, like mine, need to get down to 0 emissions within 6 to 12 years with today's emission speed. Because how can we expect countries like India, Colombia or Nigeria to care about the climate crisis if we, who already have everything, don't care even a second about our actual commitments to the Paris Agreement? So when school started in August this year, I sat myself down on the ground outside the Swedish Parliament. I school striked for the climate. Some people say that I should be in school instead. Some people say that I should study to become a climate scientist so that I can solve the climate crisis. But the climate crisis has already been solved. We already have all the facts and solutions. And why should I be studying for a future that soon may be no more, when no one is doing anything to save that future? And what is the point of learning facts when the most important facts clearly means nothing to our society? Today we use 100 million barrels of oil every single day. There are no politics to change that. There are no rules to keep that oil in the ground. So we can no longer save the world by playing by the rules, because the rules have to be changed. So we have not come here to beg the world leaders to care for our future. They have ignored us in the past and they will ignore us again. We have come here to let them know that change is coming, whether they like it or not. The people will rise to the challenge. And since our leaders are behaving like children, we will have to take the responsibility they should have taken long ago. Thank you.
That was Greta Thunberg addressing the United Nations here in Katowice, Poland. Renowned climate activist Kevin Anderson tweeted, on climate change, Greta Thunberg demonstrates more clarity and leadership in one speech than a quarter of a century of the combined contributions of so-called world leaders. Willful ignorance and lies have overseen a 65% rise in carbon dioxide since 1990. Time to hand over the baton, he tweeted. We'll have Kevin Anderson on later in the broadcast, but we're now joined by Greta Thunberg. She has been named one of Time magazine's most influential teens of 2018. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Greta. It's wonderful to have you with us.
Thank you for having me here.
So you sat outside the Swedish Parliament in September every day when all the other kids were in school. What made you decide to go to the Swedish Parliament?
Well, it started with a couple of youth in the United States refused to go to school because of the school shootings. And then someone I knew said, what if children did that for the climate? And then I thought... Oh, you're talking about the Parkland students in Parkland, Florida, after the massacre there, Valentine's Day. And then I thought that was a good idea, that maybe it would make a difference. And then I tried to bring people with me, but no one was really interested, so I had to do it alone. And but so you just... The second day, people started joining me. Why climate change? Why is that so important to you? Because what we do now, future generations can't undo in the future. We are deciding right now how we want our future to look like.
And when did you decide climate change was the issue you wanted to devote your life to?
I have read a lot about it, and one thing that I found very scary is tipping points. That once we reach tipping points, then there's no going back. Then we start a chain reaction beyond our control, and that is very scary. And so that I thought, instead of worrying about how a future might turn out, you should try to change it while you still can. So that's what I wanted to do.
So how have you changed your life once you started to learn about climate change?
I personally have stopped flying. I have stopped eating meat and dairy.
So let's take these one at a time. You stopped flying. So how did you get here to Poland? You live in Sweden.
Yeah, we went here by electrical car.
How long did it take you to drive here?
2 days, including one night at a hotel.
Mm-hmm. And why did you stop eating meat?
Both of ethical reasons and by ecological reasons.
And what else have you done?
I have a shop stop. It means that you don't buy new things, unless it's absolutely necessary.
Mm-hmm. Talk about what you're wearing, your sweatshirt today.
Oh, this is a shirt from Hundar Utan Hem, Dogs Without Home, a Swedish organization which give homeless dogs a home.
Do you have dogs?
Yes, I have 2 dogs. One is from there.
One is from that shelter?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. So how do you feel being here at the UN Climate Summit? How long have you studied the issue?
We arrived here last Saturday, so a little bit more than a week now we've been here, and I started reading about the climate crisis when I was maybe 9 years old. In school, my teachers, they told me about it, and I thought that it was very strange that humans, who are an animal species among others, could be capable of changing the Earth's climate. Because if that was the case, and if it was really happening, we wouldn't be talking about anything else. But that would be our first priority, but no one ever even mentions it. So I started reading about it, and the more I read about it, the more I understood it. And once you fully understand what it means, you can never go back.
So it's interesting you are sitting in front of the Swedish parliament every day for 3 weeks, considering most people think of Sweden as one of the most progressive when it comes to climate change.
Yeah, we have a reputation of being very, very green, but Sweden is one of the top 10 countries in the world with the highest ecological footprints per capita. And we have very high emissions per capita, and so we are not a role model.
The emissions have actually gone up in the last year?
Yeah, we have just moved them overseas. Our actual emissions in the country may have reduced, but we have just moved our emissions overseas. We let other countries produce the stuff we consume.
Greta, how do you explain climate change to other kids?
It depends on how old they are, but that we need to change now because we are not living within the planetary boundaries, and we are risking future generations' future by continuing like this. We need to change ourselves now because tomorrow it might be too late.
What did the Swedish parliamentarians say as they would pass you each day, going up the stairs and down the stairs?
Most of them ignored me, and then some of them came up to me and said that you're doing a good job, but very few.
So you started getting a lot of attention?
Yeah.
Did people bring you food?
Some.
Did that change what you ate?
No.
We're going to break for music, and then we're going to come back to this discussion. And we'll not only be speaking with Greta Thunberg, but also with her dad, Svante. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back with them in a moment. That's the classic tune Flight of the Bumblebee by Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov being sung by Swedish opera singer Lena Emma, the mother of our guest, Greta Thunberg. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Greta's staying with us for the hour, 15-year-old climate activist who came to the UN Climate Summit, where we're broadcasting today, in Katowice, Poland, with her dad, Svante, who is an actor in Sweden, her mother, an opera singer. They came by electric car over 2 days because she refuses to fly. She sat down in front of the Swedish parliament for 3 weeks in September, not going to school. After the Swedish elections, she went to school 4 days a week and continued her sit-in every Friday. Greta, thanks for staying with us. Svante Thunberg is also joining us right now. Svante, how has your daughter changed you?
Oh, in every possible way, I'd say. It started maybe 4 years ago. She was very she got herself in a position where she was learning a lot about the climate change. And she was finding out that everyone was saying one thing and doing the exact other thing. And that she could not cope with. So she fell into a depression, she stopped eating, stopped talking, and she fell out of school and stayed at home for almost a year. And my wife and I we stayed at home with her, of course, and we did everything. I stopped working completely and we spent, all our time with her.
Now, you're a well-known actor, your wife is a well-known opera singer, and you both gave up your professions.
Yes, my wife is much more well-known than I am. I gave up my career when she was born, actually, because my wife was working overseas. So I basically...
housewife.
Yeah, I went to become a housewife instead. So, but I do act sometimes.
And you have 2 daughters.
Yes, we have 2 daughters. Beata as well, yeah.
So, Greta, can you talk about that time? It sounds extremely painful, a few years ago when you stopped talking and stopped eating.
Yes, I became very depressed. I fell into depression, and I didn't think that it was... I was so depressed I didn't see any point of living because everything was just so wrong. And I kind of saw, because I have Asperger's syndrome, so I work a bit different. I see things black and white. And so I guess I saw the world from a different perspective. So I saw what was wrong with the world. And
What does it mean to have Asperger's syndrome?
That my brain works a bit different. And I usually don't enjoy participating in the social game that the rest of you seem so fond of. And I don't like lying, and I see things black or white.
And you focus with laser intensity on an issue.
Yeah.
Your issue, climate change. And Svante, what did this mean for you? How have you raised your daughters to deal with the world and in this crisis when Greta stopped eating and was almost hospitalized?
Yeah, she made us realize that we were these parents, standing up for human rights and refugees and right and wrong and all these things. And we were really fighting for that. And then she said, whose human rights are you standing up for? When my wife, for instance, went to Japan to make concerts and being on Japanese TV, very important. It's a good reason to travel across the world to do that. But when she got home, Greta worked out how many tons of carbon dioxide she had spent on that, and how many people's carbon budget that was living in West Africa, for instance. So she basically, confronted us with that. Whose human rights are you standing up for when you are draining the world's, resources, a functioning atmosphere, for instance, and so we basically realized in the end, after a couple of years of her going on about it, that we had to change. We had to stop doing these things, and that really had an enormous effect because she made her much more happy, and she changed a lot with that. So yeah.
So what made you decide to start eating again and start talking? Greta?
I mean, I guess I thought that I could do so much with my life. What is the point of feeling like this when I could actually do something good? And so, yeah.
Is your sister older or younger than you?
She's 3 years younger than me.
Mm-hmm. And how has she been affected by your choices?
I mean, she has also stopped flying and so on, and she also cares about the climate and the environment.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And how has it changed the way you parent, Svante?
Well, it changed. My wife she gave up her international opera career, and she's working out of Sweden now instead, and that was a big change for us. And obviously, it's changed a great many other sort of things. I had to go vegan, first of all vegetarian, then I had to go vegan, and I do miss the cheese. I must confess. But it's no, I mean. So
what did it mean to you to give up meat and then
nothing,
and
really.
then cheese and dairy?
Nothing. It meant nothing. I mean, in the end, we're facing a diet catastrophe, and but I just didn't realize.
We asked Greta in the first segment why she became a vegetarian. And are you a vegan also, Greta?
Yeah.
So, Svante, what does that mean to you? Why not have a meat-based diet?
Well, because of the climate crisis. I mean, obviously, we are running out of a budget, okay? I mean, the budget is disappearing before our eyes, and we only have a couple of years, less than a couple of years, to bend the curve, steep down like a roller coaster. And I think I didn't have a clue about the climate crisis before she got us all interested in this. But once you start, walking down that path, there's no going back, and it changes your life is changed in every possible way once you realize, the situation that we're actually in. But I was so amazed that I wasn't aware of it, because I was, very aware. I was reading all the papers and stuff, and I just didn't realize where we were at. Yeah.
What did it mean to you that your parents became vegan? Is your mother also vegan, Greta?
Yeah, she tries.
You're teaching her. So what did that mean to you, how you changed your parents?
I mean, that meant that they were actually listening to what I was saying. And, I mean, that was good to feel that someone is listening.
Svante, you talked about basically climate equity, about how when you consume a lot, when the Western countries like Sweden are engaged in fossil fuel pollution, what that means for the developing world. Greta, I'd like to ask you that question, this whole issue of climate equity.
Yeah, I mean, since we have a higher emissions per capita, we must reduce emissions more. And since we already have all the infrastructure and everything that we need to reduce our emissions much more so that the developing countries can have a chance to build some of that infrastructure, and so that the people there can have a chance to heighten their standard of living.
Also, the effects of climate change on other countries that can least afford to cope with the change. We're talking with Svante and Greta Thunberg. Can you talk about your relatives? You are both the descendants of Svante Arrhenius, the Nobel Prize-winning scientist who first calculated the greenhouse effect caused by carbon dioxide emissions in 1896, known to some as the father of climate change science. Svante, you were named after him?
Yes, I was. My family named me after him, or my father did, because he thought, that was very important. But the fact is, they didn't have a clue why he got the Nobel Prize. They, he was just a Nobel Prize winner. Yeah, it's pretty nice, nice title. So he's, my father's born in 1925, he's pretty old, and his grandmother's cousin, I think, is Svante Arrhenius. So, it runs in the family. I was, I didn't realize until I started reading up on the subject, but that's our relative. Yeah.
And And Greta, you are now, when you're not here at the UN Climate Summit, by the way, I want to point out, we're in this building here in Katowice, the main conference center of this city, that is actually shaped like a coal mine. You know, everywhere around us is black, and you sort of descend down. I don't know if you were aware of that. Also, right by the Poland exhibit, which is called Black to Green, did you see this? Are necklaces that have made out of coal hearts. There's coal soap. It's soap in the shape of coal. Maybe kind of celebrating coal. Very interesting when we came to the Warsaw Summit, and it's the only country that has hosted the UN Climate Summit 3 times. It hosted it in Poznan, then in Warsaw, and now we're in Katowice. Katowice, the heart of coal country in Poland. The coal company is clearly very prominent here. Your thoughts on that and what coal means for the world?
I mean, it's just crazy that we are here on the climate change conference, and I think it's sponsored by a coal company. But we need to stop burning coal, as simple as that.
You are protesting every Friday outside the Swedish Parliament now, from every weekday to just Fridays. Why Fridays?
Why not? Fridays are good days. Friday's a good day to strike.
You call it a school strike. You've also been following and tweeting about other school strikes around the world. Yeah. How many have there been?
Oh, I don't know many. Tens of thousands of kids in Australia, also strikes in Belgium, Canada, the US, the UK, Finland, Denmark, Sweden, France, the Netherlands. I probably forgot something now, but yeah, it's a lot of places.
So Greta, I'd like you to stay with us for the hour, and then we are also going to be joined by the well-known climate scientist, Kevin Anderson. We're talking with 15-year-old climate activist, Greta Thunberg, here with her father, Svante. Svante, thanks so much for joining us and for bringing Greta here.
Thank you so much.
Greta, by the way, who addressed the world here at the UN Climate Summit. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back with Greta Thunberg and Kevin Anderson in a moment. My Place on Earth, sung by Malena Erdman, the famous Swedish opera singer, who also happens to be the mother of our guest today, 15-year-old climate activist Greta Thunberg. Yes, this is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. We're broadcasting from the UN Climate Summit right here in Katowice, Poland. And we're continuing our conversation with Greta, who's been on a school strike calling for climate action. She sits outside the Swedish parliament every Friday. In September, before the election, she sat for 3 weeks straight on weekdays. A number of kids also then started to join her. We're also joined by the renowned climate scientist Kevin Anderson, professor in climate change leadership at the Center for Environment and Development Studies, Uppsala University, also chair of energy and climate change at the Tyndall Center for Climate Change Research at the University of Manchester in Britain. Kevin recently tweeted, on climate change, Greta Thunberg demonstrates more clarity and leadership in one speech than a quarter of a century of the combined contributions of so-called world leaders. Willful ignorance and lies have overseen a 65% rise in carbon dioxide since 1990. Time to hand over the baton, he writes. Well, it's great to have you both with us. Greta, explain again how you made it to Poland, how you got here from Sweden.
Yeah, me and my dad drove here in an electrical car.
Do you use an electric car all over Sweden, or do you use other forms of transportation?
Sometimes that, and sometimes train, bus, subway.
Mm-hmm. I also understand you do a lot of bike riding.
Yeah.
So, Kevin, how did you get here from Britain?
Oh, I came from Sweden as well, actually. So I didn't come by electric car. I came by train and then got the ferry from south of Stockholm to Gdansk, and then the train down to Katowice.
So that's a political decision that you've made as well.
It is, but
you don't take planes?
No, but I don't think about it particularly anymore. I don't look at the flights and say, well, what the flight's like. I just look at how do I get there without flying. Why without flying? Well, it's probably... Emblematically, it's the most important activity that we pursue. The emissions are important. They're 2 to 3% of world emissions, about the same as UK, Germany or California, so a significant amount of emissions. But actually, when we fly, we are locking in an industry that is very high carbon, that there are no technical alternatives in the near to medium term to overcome that, so we remain high carbon. And also, those of us who fly, generally, we also live very wealthy lives. We often use taxis, we live in big homes, we have quite large cars, we drive a lot, we consume a lot of goods. So it is emblematic. It captures the worst excesses in terms of our climate change impacts and also, indeed, broader sustainability. And so I think it's important for people who work on climate change, who think it's a really major issue, that we demonstrate that we believe in our own research by making some significant changes to how we operate our own lives.
Greta's father, Svante, is named after a climate scientist. Can you talk about his significance?
Well, his significance was major, as were a number of people in the 1800s. So when people talk about climate change as a new phenomenon, it's not. It's the laws of physics. There's no such thing as climate science. There is science we use to understand the climate. And that science we've been using for several centuries now. And during the 1800s, there was Fourier, there was John Tyndall, the namesake of the centre I'm involved with, and there was Arrhenius in Sweden. And these people were putting together a fairly clear vision of what was causing not climate change, what was understanding global warming, and the greenhouse effect, and how that might play out in the future. So we had a good understanding, even in the 1800s. So it's not a new phenomenon, as the skeptics often try to suggest.
So you teach in Sweden as well as in Britain?
I do, but in English in Sweden, I hasten to add. I don't teach in Swedish.
So what did you think when you heard about this kid, this 15-year-old girl, this young woman named Greta Thunberg, who sat down in front of the Swedish parliament? When did you first hear this?
Well, it was, I think, after you'd first started doing it, so it was quite some time ago now. And as soon as I heard about it, I just think it's good that something is... Well, firstly, bringing climate change to the fore, to the public debate, is important. It's not in the public debate. This COP has been very poorly represented in the media that I'm aware of in other parts of Europe. So bringing climate change to the fore is a really important issue anyway. The second thing is to bring it to the fore with a degree of clarity and honesty is also really important, and Greta has done that in spades. You know, she's been a real ambassador for understanding climate change without all of the fluff and nonsense that we put on.
When you sat down, Jutta, in September in front of the Parliament, was there a discussion in the media? I mean, Sweden considered a very green country about climate change?
Yes, it was, and it still is. I mean, all of Swedes say, oh, we're the best in the world. We have technology and we have low emissions and so on.
So you weren't satisfied, though?
No.
Why?
Because we aren't.
In what way? What are the effects that you feel climate change has in other parts of the world? And what has it meant for you to be here, meeting other people and young people from especially the developing world and from island nations that might be submerged?
I mean, Swedes are living like if we had 4.2 planet Earths. And I mean, that means that we steal very much resources from future generations and poorer parts of the world. And I mean, it's us, the people in the rich countries and the rich countries that have created these problems.
Kevin, can you talk about the difference between the Trump administration being here? Their one side event yesterday was introducing representatives of the fossil fuel industry. They call it realistic and rational because they care about jobs, they say. And the previous administration under President Obama.
Well, firstly, I think you have to question whether they care about jobs or whether they care about profits. Certainly there's something that they care about. But whether a lot of people I know, people who are concerned about climate change, think of Trump, and they use Trump to some extent as an excuse for the inaction of the rest of us. And if you look at what Obama had planned, Obama's climate plans, OK, were slightly more progressive or less unprogressive, if such a thing can exist, than, compared to Trump. But nevertheless, Obama was not moving the US towards anything approaching the Paris Agreement. His plans were much more in line with a 3 to 4 degrees centigrade of warming. And people were just saying, oh, isn't he doing well? So Trump comes along and basically just stands up and, in the usual Trumpian way and just says, I'm not going to be involved in climate change. It's a hoax by the Chinese. And that suddenly brings climate change to the fore. People start to talk about it again. So the Macron talks about what the French are going to do. The Chinese say they'll step up to the plate to compensate for what America's doing. Other American mayors come to the fore. So in some respects, Trump has reignited a stagnant debate on climate change. So whilst I have no time for Trump's views on climate change, or indeed on many other issues, I think he has been to some extent a catalyst. And when you align that with Greta's contribution and increasingly voices who feel that they've been marginalised over the last 20 years on climate change, they are coming to the fore. I think there is a sense of a new dialogue emerging, not just from climate change, but from the sort of dissatisfaction with how the establishment has dealt with issues over the last 20 or 30 years.
I mean, going back to Copenhagen, going back 10 years ago, you had President Obama flying in, and many felt weakening the accord.
Yes, yeah. I mean, the US, it's easy at the moment with people pick on Russia, the US and Qatar and so forth, saying they're weakening haven't accepted the IPCC 1.5 degrees C report. And it's true they haven't done that, but again, that is something that the rest of us have hidden behind. The other nations will say, isn't that appalling? The UK say, of course we should accept the 1.5 degree C report, whilst it's just celebrated a new BP oil platform going offshore that's going to produce 120,000 barrels of oil every day. That's 50,000 tonnes of carbon dioxide every day, and over the life of the platform, another 250 million tonnes of CO2. That's a UK government saying we must sign the 1.5 degree C, we must welcome the 1.5 degree C report from the IPCC, whilst it's celebrating new oil platforms, it's trying to develop new gas, and it's expanding its airports. So we mustn't hide behind Trump or Obama's inadequacy. The rest of us, the rest of the progressive world, are still failing. As Greta points out, even in Sweden, which in many respects is a very progressive country. If you come from the UK, it feels like that. But even in Sweden, they're choosing to do nothing significant on climate change.
Well, let me turn to that side conference, the side program that was held yesterday by the U.S. shortly before he was interrupted by protesters at a forum on the sidelines of the COP on Monday. COP, it's called for Conference of Parties, this UN climate summit. President President Trump's advisor on energy climate, Wells Griffith, praised what he called a U.S. energy renaissance.
Some of the most important factors leading to this renaissance were the dramatic breakthroughs in hydraulic fracturing and horizontal drilling, which has led to increasingly efficient production of natural gas and crude oil. As a result, the United States is now the #1 combined oil and gas producer in the world. Technological advances are also driving the growth and reducing cost of renewables as well. And the same technology revolution is also making U.S. fuels cleaner by nearly all measures.
So there you have the climate advisor to President Trump. Your response, Kevin Anderson.
Just look at the numbers. This year, carbon dioxide emissions have gone up by 2.7%. That came out during the COP, the latest set of data. And when you unpick that, okay, it is easy to blame China and India, the poorer countries, trying to industrialize. Their emissions are certainly rising. You look at the US emissions have also gone up. And that's because they've been burning far more oil in their cars, which are even larger than they were last year. So even in the US, he can talk about renewables, but really the focus by him and by the advisor and by the Trump administration is just producing and consuming ever more fossil fuels. There is no responsibility there for the issues of climate change. It is a complete denial of climate change, which in a sense is a denial of physics. It's a denial of science. So it's not to be surprised. We should not be surprised by what he is saying. We must not use that as an excuse again, just to beat him and the Trump administration for when we are making no changes ourselves.
We have to be realistic, not alarmist.
Yeah, I agree. We have to be realistic. We have to be realistic. Is it reasonable to live with 3, 4 or 5 degrees centigrade of warming? And I think all analysis, probably even his own, if he bothered to undertake any, would say that is not realistic. So we are left with this, we're between a rock and a hard place. We have to make dramatic reductions in our carbon dioxide emissions now to ensure a stable climate for our future and Greta's futures and Greta's children's futures. Or we have to just let things carry on with this realistic view about oil and gas today, knowing that we are leaving this legacy for future generations and for all other species, which will be completely chaotic.
Let's talk about who's responsible for the majority of greenhouse gas emissions. An Oxfam study found only 10% of the world's population produces approximately half of all global emissions.
Yes.
Take it from there.
Well, firstly, although Oxfam used that data, that originally came from some work by Lucas Chancel and Thomas Piketty. And Piketty is well known for his work as an economist. And that demonstrates that rather than necessarily always focus on countries, we need to focus on the people who are actually emitting. So the idea that 10% of the global population are responsible for 50% of global emissions, or 20% of the global population are responsible for 70% of all global emissions, tells us that we need to be tailoring our policies towards that small group, rather than trying to squeeze the emissions out of the majority of the world's population, who are hardly emitting anything at all. So one of the ways to explain this that I often use, which will hopefully be helpful, is that if that 10% of high emitters reduce their carbon footprint, their individual carbon footprint, to the level of the average European citizen, that would be equivalent of a 1/3 cut in global emissions, even if the other 90% did nothing. Remember, a 1/3 cut in global emissions just from the 10% reducing to the level of the average European citizen.
I want to ask Greta about this in 1 minute, but if you can lay out for us who consumes what in the United States, in the Western countries, in places like Sweden, how much energy they consume versus someone in the developing world?
Well, if you look at it in relation to their emissions, if you looked at, say, Rwandans, they might be consuming or might be emitting something like 0.1 to 0.5 of a ton.
People in Rwanda.
Yeah, people in Rwanda, yeah. If you look at the typical American, they're going to be consuming or emitting something like 30 to 35 tons. 30 to 35 tons for the average American compared with 0.1-ish for the average Rwandan. So you're seeing a massive difference between those two.
And what are people doing, like in the United States, in Europe? And how does people in the United States and Europe compare?
Well, very approximately, America is twice that. The US is twice the emissions of the average European. But
because?
Well, because they have bigger houses, bigger cars, they travel further, they still have a very high carbon energy system for electricity generation.
You can't find an incandescent light bulb in Europe that's being sold?
No, they've been outlawed now or banned, yes. Yeah. So, I mean, the EU has made some significant attempts to improve efficiency, but now those attempts in efficiency have never compensated for the increase in growth. Hence, the European Union's overall emissions have remained roughly static if you take into account of the goods that we import and export.
So, Greta, as we end this show, what message to the world would you like to share? And what are your plans for the future? What grade are you in now in Sweden?
In 9th grade.
In 9th grade. You can look directly into the camera as you speak.
My message for the world is that we have now a short period of time where we can act. And if we don't take that chance, we're screwed. And so we have to take that chance to act now, because it might be too late, and we don't want to be screwed.
So that is Greta Thunberg, and if you're looking her up, that's Thunberg. Greta is 15 years old, a climate activist from Sweden, got here by electric car. She's just been named by Time magazine as one of the 100 most influential teens in the world. We've also been joined by Kevin Anderson, leading climate scientist, professor in climate change leadership in both Uppsala, Sweden, as well as in Manchester, Britain. And we're going to end today's show with some breaking news. It's absolutely critical as we bring you this information to know that we just interviewed a guest who is, we're going to turn right now to that information as we talked about Time magazine. Time magazine has announced it's honoring journalists as its 2018 Person of the Year. The magazine has published its cover for the year, honoring the Washington Post columnist Jamal Khashoggi, who was killed in the Saudi consulate, and Filipino journalist Maria Ressa, founder of independent news site Rappler. She was just recently charged in the Philippines. Reuters journalists Walon and Kwa So'o, who are currently imprisoned in Burma for investigating a massacre of Rohingya Muslims. And finally, the Capital Gazette of Annapolis, Maryland, where earlier this year a gunman opened fire, killing 4 journalists and 1 other employee. Time is calling the recipients of this year's tribute the Guardians and the War on Truth. That does it for our broadcast. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Ravi Karen, Hani Masood, Sharina Nadura. Special thanks to Dennis Moynihan as well. I'm Amy Goodman. Thanks for joining us.